You guys made it. We're almost finished. So when I first got here 12 years ago, my very first series, I asked the question, what type of church do you want to be? And we asked several small groups that question. And then Mark Hill, some of you remember Mark, he and I took that information and we sat down and we kind of developed a plan how to get to be the type of church you wanted us to be. Okay. Another question that I asked Mark and I asked the elders, and I asked several people, because you had spent quite a long time in Romans. So I asked, when was the last time you were in the Old Testament? And nobody could remember. That's how far back it was. And it's like, okay, we're going to spend time in the Old Testament. We have done that. And we've gone through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. We finished Numbers today. Okay. The Pentateuch, those are the first 5 books, the books of Moses, they're called. They contain the law of Moses, but they contain more than that. So the first 5 books are actually considered one book in 5 chapters. And each of the books are about the same length, and that's about the size of a scroll. That's how they kind of broke it up. So they titled things. Your English Bible has a slightly different titling than the Hebrew. For example, Numbers, the English is Numbers, but they title it in Hebrew in the desert or in the wilderness. And so the emphasis on Numbers is because the very first chapter and then chapter 26 is all about numbers. Okay, how many people we have in each tribe. And so when we started out there. It's kind of like where we started 12 years ago. It was very boring. Okay, and we did the census, and ended up that first census was the census of death. Everyone in that census died because they numbered all the men 20 years old and upward. And then you probably remember the story. He sent the spies into the land, and they came back, 10 of them, and said, no, we can't do it. So they turned away, only Joshua and Caleb. So God said, because of your lack of faith, then only Joshua and Caleb are going to enter the promised land. So when we get to Numbers 26, the second census is the census of life. Those are the ones that are now the second generation. The first generation has passed. So when I laid out originally these books of Moses, what I said was, okay, Genesis is kind of a picture of here's how we got to where we are. Okay. And it goes through the whole problem of the fall, we call the fall, and sin, and what God's going to do. And he brings along Abraham in Genesis 12 and says, I promise, Abraham, because of your faith, that I'm going to raise up a people too numerous for you to count. Okay? You can't even count them. And so that's where it ends, is Abraham's family. Then we skip quite a bit of time, and Exodus starts. Now they're enslaved. And they've been there for a long time. God said that would happen. In Genesis 15, when he's talking to Abraham, Abraham said, how do I know that you're going to give me this land and that you're going to fulfill the covenant? And God said, well, I'm going to take all the people out of the land, all of your descendants. I'm going to take them out of the land for over 400 years, where they're going to be mistreated. And the reason is to give the people in the land, the Amorites or the Canaanites, to give them a chance to make their decision. Are they going to trust me as the one true God or not? And so they made their decision. No, we're going to follow our own gods. So God brings Israel out of slavery, and that's the story of Exodus. The Exodus out of slavery. By the way, at the Mount of Transfiguration, when Jesus is there talking to the 2 others and the 3 disciples are watching, they were discussing his exodus. In Greek, it's the same word. His exodus from this world to lead us out of slavery, but it's no longer slavery to Egypt, it's slavery to sin. And that's what we just celebrated right there. So then, when you get to Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, it's kind of modeled after a Jewish wedding ceremony. So Exodus is where God says to them, gives the 10 Commandments and said, here's what I want you to obey, the 10 Commandments. Those 10 Commandments are, they're unchanging for eternity, okay? And they're the permanent set of commandments that they should control every nation. And so that's God basically extending an invitation to marriage. Will you make the commitment? If you will commit, Exodus 19, he says, out of all the nations, I will choose you to be my prized possession. I will make you a kingdom of priests. Now remember, they're slaves. They've only been out of the desert for about 5 weeks. In the desert, out of Egypt. And they're going, wow, we get to be slaves. They didn't know what that meant. So he said, I'll make you out of all the nations, you will be my prized possession. I'll make you a kingdom of priests. I'll make you a holy nation. You will be different than all the other nations, not because you're better, but because you will be my display of grace so that all the other nations will come. And that was part of Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple. When the foreigner hears of your great name, because they will indeed hear, and they come to this temple, then listen to their prayers and answer their prayers so that they'll come to know that you're the one true God. So he chose Israel, not because they're better. In fact, he makes it a point. I chose you. You were the smallest nation so that I could reveal my glory through you so the nations would come. And we see that happening. We have Ruth, who's from what country? Moab. Ruth, Moabitess. Okay, you have Uriah. Where's Uriah from? The Hittites. Right? So we have examples of people from other nations coming to Israel to learn about the one true God and abandon their gods who are fake. So that's Exodus. He says, if you obey me, this is what I will do. And they say 3 times in Exodus 24, all that the Lord has said, we will do. I love it. And they turn right around and build the golden calf. It's just one of those funny stories to me. They're just like us today. Okay, we make a promise and then we turn around and break it. And so this is the betrothal. This is the period where God says, will you marry me? If you do, I will take care of you. And they say, yes, we will. Then we go into Leviticus, which we studied. And Leviticus is all the what we call the holiness code of what does God desire of you. He's not a demanding God. The law of Moses was not complicated. It wasn't difficult to understand. It wasn't confusing. It was very simple. Okay? Whenever you want to make an offering, here's how you do it. All the other nations commanded them to make offerings. So he presents what we now know as the Mosaic Law, and it's a wonderful law when you compare it with all the ancient law codes. All the other ancient law codes, they protected the males in society by controlling everybody else. The Mosaic Law reversed that, controlled the males for the benefit of everybody else who had lost their rights and privileges. At this time, for example, women, you had no rights. And he begins to establish rights. No longer could the male husbands beat their wives. That was true in Egypt. You could do that. You could do that with the Amorites and the Hittites, but you couldn't do it with Israel. Can't beat your wife. And he begins to reverse this whole process of dignity that was lost at the fall, and he establishes rights for everybody within the nation, including the animals and the trees that had lost all of their dignity. And that's what the Mosaic Law was overturning that. So then when we get to Numbers, now they're ready. Okay, it's been about 13 months that they've been out of Egypt, and they're ready to go to the Promised Land. So he takes them up there, and what happens? The spies go in, they came back and said, we can't go there. They're bigger than us. I mean, I have a lot of respect for them because they were sent slaves. They had never been a fighting unit, and they're looking at people bigger, stronger, and more experienced than them, but they didn't have faith. God says, all right, out to the desert you go for 40 years. And they decide to go ahead, well then, okay, if that's the case, we'll go ahead and fight. Well, that was a mistake too because God said no. So the Hebrew title for Numbers is in the desert. It's the wandering period of which all of you have experienced at some time in life, a desert experience. What it's like to feel alone, to feel, why is God doing this to me? All right? And so he takes them for 40 years. And there we asked the question early in Numbers, was that a curse or was that a blessing? Well, they had to pay the price. That's what the thing is with sin. But it wasn't a curse, it was a blessing. It gave them a chance to raise up a second generation who would trust the Lord. So when we got to Numbers 26, we have the second generation. And when they go into the land, guess what? They said, we can do this. There was faith. So the first generation learned their lesson, paid the price, trained the second generation. The second generation, they go into the land. So the second census is a census of life. And right in the middle of Numbers 26, you have all of these men listed, and a little parentheses, and Zelophehad, one of the males, had 5 daughters. And he names the daughters. And so these 5 daughters, because the inheritance laws were very simple. Remember, they're on the east side of the Jordan. They haven't crossed over yet into the Promised Land. The inheritance laws were very simple. Inheritance was a way to legally own property. And God said, I'll give each of the tribes property. So the inheritance laws were if the man dies, the land passes to the sons. If there are no sons, it passes to his brothers. Okay? So it stays in the tribe because men were the only ones that owned property. I don't know if you've seen Pride and Prejudice. How many of you have seen Pride and Prejudice? That's based on the original inheritance laws, which they never actually lived out. Because these 5 daughters, they're my heroes. They go to the tent of meeting, which was the tabernacle, and they said, we don't like this law. We don't think it's fair that our father died in the land and we have no brothers and we don't get anything. We're women. Why don't we get it? So Moses, being the brave soul that he is, he goes to God and said, the daughters are complaining. What do I do? And he goes, they have a valid case. So he rewrote the law right then on the spot. So the new law is if there are no brothers, the land passes as a legal inheritance to the daughters. I believe, I have not found any other place to show this in my research and studies. It's the first time women own property. Changed world history. Women got to own property as a legal inheritance. Okay? The wandering for 40 years only takes place for about 12 or 15 chapters. That's it in Numbers. And then the rest of Numbers is God making adjustments to the law because they're not a nomadic tribe wandering through the desert in tents. They're getting ready to go into the promised land. And so some of the laws no longer work once you're settled in the land. Okay? So he begins to make adjustments to the law because now they're going to be a settled nation. Okay? And you can't do everything that you used to do. I mean, when your tent's right there by the tabernacle, you kill an animal, you take it down, the priest blesses it. Well, they can no longer do that because you may live 100 miles away. So they changed several of the laws and began to make adjustment so that as they settle in the land. One of the things he did, which we looked at last week, was he established for the Levites, they didn't get a plot of land, they got a city. They got 48 cities scattered throughout all the nation. And that was God's way of saying the priests are going to be scattered around the nation to take care of you. They didn't have 37 editions of the Bible on their devices. Okay, they didn't have that. So the priests were the ones who devoted their lives to studying the scriptures so they could be a blessing. That was the responsibility of the priests. And by the way, you're now all priests according to 1 Peter 2. Paul says the same thing. And that was the original promise. I'm going to make all of you a kingdom of priests. And so priests do 3 things. They bring people into God's presence. They bring God out to the people through their teaching. And then they bless the people. Okay, that's what priests do. And so God scattered the priests throughout the nation, everywhere they were, so that they always had somebody that they could go to and say, we don't know what to do here. And so the law established equal dignity for everybody. Didn't matter where you were. So people have asked me over the years, well, what about the laws on hygiene? Or if you got mold on the wall, scrape it off. Okay, how does that bless everybody? Well, if you've ever been to a third world country and you see the poorest of the poor, I've seen the poorest in the world, they don't have access to any of that. I mean, they're dirt poor. They don't even know what basic hygiene is. But in Israel, everybody had the same rules, and the priest was there to take care of them. So the poorest person, he could say, okay, you see this stuff on the wall? That's not healthy for you. Let's scrape it off. So the poorest person had the same access as the richest person. So everybody in Israel was designed, treated with equal dignity. Okay? So now we get to the end of Numbers 36, and it's a kind of a mystifying chapter because he talks about the daughters of Zelophehad. Again, guess what? They don't want to marry who they're told to marry. These are rebellious women. I know a bunch of you are like that. Okay? Some things have never changed in history. I can think of about 50 of you sitting out there. I'm married to one of them. Okay? I mean, she's got a mind of her own. And she's going to do what she wants to do. It's really wild. And so you have to learn to live in the relationship with each other, don't you? For those of you that are married. So here they are. They don't want to marry who they're told to marry. Arranged marriages. So they go, Moses, being the brave soul that he is, goes back to God and says, what do you want me to do? So the question is, why did he finish Numbers with the example of the daughters of Zelophehad? You would have thought that, remember, this is chapter 4 of a book that we go right from Numbers. They're ready to go into the promised land, and you start Deuteronomy, and he's on the plains east of the Jordan. He's getting ready to die because God's going to take his life. He's not going to let him in. So let me share with you the rules, all the final rules, and give you And you get to make a new covenant with the Lord. Because this new generation, they weren't there when they made the covenant. They were way too young or not even born yet when he made the covenant with them in Exodus 19. Well, now we're 41 years later, and this young generation is now grown up, and these are the adults. So he goes over the law with them, including the adjustments to the law, now that they're in a settled land. And he said, so now, are you willing to make the covenant and live in faith? And they say, yes. All that the Lord has said, we will do. That's what you just heard up here this morning. Why do you want to be baptized? Because I believe in Jesus. That's why. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. So we got this puzzling chapter. It's not very long. It's only 13 verses. But as I look through my commentaries, it's kind of funny. Some of the commentaries do an excellent job of every chapter except this one. They don't even talk about it. Okay? Because it's a puzzle. Why finish this incredible saga? Think of the first 5 books as this saga. Okay? I mean, we're going from creation all the way to going into the promised land. And God's working with them. All throughout Numbers, remember? We talked about it. If you just read it, if you don't read it carefully, it looks like they rebel, God punishes, they rebel, God punishes, they rebel. I mean, it's ad nauseum. That's what it looks like, the same cycle, but it's not really true. Hopefully you got that out of Numbers. Because every time God interacts with them in Numbers, he responds to them in a different way than he did the time before. He never repeats he never repeats himself in the way he disciplines, the way he helps them grow. Okay? And we begin to learn principles. First of all, as a Christian, we don't believe in what's called retributive justice. Retributive justice is punishment. Everybody loves to quote 1 John 1:9, right? Perfect love casts out fear. But nobody quotes the second half because fear has to do with punishment. There is no punishment, not for the Christian. So we begin to learn through this series that there's this concept called discipline, which is not punishment. Discipline is what you go through. Let's say you want to play soccer. So you go to the coach and say, I want to play soccer. I have a 14-year-old grandson who plays soccer. I said, what do you do in practice? He goes, we run. Okay, that's discipline. You want to play soccer? Start running. Okay. In fact, I watched my 2 grandsons. One plays football and one plays soccer. And one says, football is not a real sport because you don't really run. You just hit each other. And then the other one says, soccer's not a real sport because you don't hit each other. Okay, you just kick some stupid ball around. It's fun listening to them at dinner the other night, debating each other. But they both had to go through a disciplined process. You want to play soccer? Start running. That's not punishment. Okay, and that's what we begin to see. For the faithful, and we see it in all the minor prophets. We talked about that a couple of years ago. For all the minor prophets, it's not punishment. Not for the faithful. Now, they're caught in the middle of people that are very unfaithful, and the punishment is for the nation who rebel against God. But for the faithful, he reminds them in the middle of every prophet. So in Lamentations, one of the hardest books to read because it's in the final days of Jerusalem. The walls are days, if not hours, away from crumbling, and they're surrounded by the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar. And it's about to become a horrible existence. They've been besieged so long, they're eating the dead. It's a tragic book. And right in the middle of it, to Jeremiah, who wrote it, and his small little remnant of faithful, he says, the Lord's mercies are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. And that's what we believe. So as a believer, there's no punishment. There may be discipline, so we learn how to live Christian life, but not punishment. That's why Paul and Hebrews can talk about we avoid the wrath of God because of that. And so you would think at the end of Numbers, we're getting ready to go into the promised land. Here's the saga unfolding. And so we're on the land, and we're on the eastern side, and Moses is going to share the final wisdom before God takes him. But no. We have the stories of the daughters of Zelophehad again. Why did he finish it this way? So I titled this sermon, A Glorious Finish, because this is a spectacular little piece of information that once again changed world history. So now let me just remind you, I'm going to show you a couple of verses. We finished with the cities of refuge. Remember that? All the cities of refuge for people that they can run to if they've killed somebody and it's been inadvertent, they could run to for protection. And the cities of refuge were in, 6 of them were set, 3 on the east of the Jordan and 3 on the west of the Jordan. But they are in the cities controlled by the Levites. And that shows us that justice is a priestly function, not a judicial function. Okay? The priests were the ones that were to administer justice. And that's part of our responsibility as priests, is to take care of the poor, the downtrodden, the marginalized, the widows, the orphans. That's our job, is to demonstrate true justice in this world. Now, in our country, most of us rely on the judicial system to administer justice. But justice just typically means, I hope you rot in hell for what you did. But that's not what justice really is. The word for justice is the same word for righteousness and justification. It's doing what's in the best interest of somebody who has really made a mistake and really screwed up badly. Okay? That's why God says, don't get vengeance. You have no idea how to do it. But I do. And so it's a priestly function. But right in the middle of this, he gives a couple of laws that survive for the rest of the time in this broken world. In Numbers 35, verse 31, do not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who deserves to die. They are to be put to death. That has not changed. One of the things we argued at this chapter last week was that vengeance and a whole justice system has transferred from the individual, what we call the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So in every country, justice or vengeance was an individual thing. You kill my wife, I'm killing your wife. Steal my cow, I'm stealing your cow. Okay? And he said, not anymore. That's why Jesus can say in the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for... No, I'm telling you there's something better than that. So just vengeance is no longer an individual responsibility. It's now been elevated to a higher level. And in Israel, it was the priestly tribe that was to administer that under God's wisdom. But these principles are still true right there. Okay, do not accept the ransom for the life of a murderer who deserves to die. They are to be put to death. Don't accept a ransom, a sacrifice for that. Okay, that is still true. Do you realize that? When you hear Jesus say that you shouldn't get angry, you shouldn't murder, but if you get angry, I tell you, you've already committed murder. Do you realize what that means? I've asked this question many times over the years. How many of you have gotten angry in the last month? You just admitted to being a church of murderers, unless Jesus is telling a joke. And he said, I tell you that you shouldn't commit adultery. I tell you, when you lust after a woman or a man, you've already committed adultery. Already. Is he joking? Paul comes along and says, don't you know that murderers and adulterers are not going to inherit the kingdom of God? Murderers? Here it is, right here. The murderer deserves to be put to death. So what that means is, if you have gotten angry or if you have lusted, you're excluded from the kingdom. Unless those guys are, Jesus and Paul, are telling a joke. That's how serious this situation is in our world today. Your understanding of grace is only as healthy as your understanding of sin. If you have a weak view of sin, you have a weak view of grace. It's just a little white lie. No, it's not. It's deserving of eternal punishment. It's deserving of death. So these principles that are laid down here are still true today. What that means is not one of us stands a chance. Not one of us. That's why Paul can say in the Corinthian epistles, don't you know that adulterers and murderers will not enter the kingdom? And then he said, and that's what you used to be. There's the gospel in one sentence. Right there. No longer are you a murderer. No longer are you an adulterer. Why? Because he says you've been justified, you've been cleansed, you've been washed by the blood of Jesus. Now we know how important the cross really is. Because without the cross, not one of us stands a chance. You're not pretty good. It doesn't work that way. Pretty good or pretty bad. Okay? And this law that he lays down right here, the murderer is worthy of death. That's true. That's why what these young kids were saying here is a watershed moment in their lives. I believe in Jesus. He becomes the ransom for us because there is no ransom available. There is none. There's nothing you can do to overcome the effect of lusting after another person. Nothing. And you're not worthy of the kingdom except through the cross. And that's why that's the centerpiece of Christianity. That's the centerpiece. So then he starts talking about, he says, don't pollute the land. Don't defile it with bloodshed, okay? And then all of a sudden he starts talking about the tribe of Joseph, okay? They come to Moses when the Lord commanded my Lord, we're in chapter 36, to give the land as an inheritance to the Israelites by lot. He ordered you to give the inheritance to our brother Zelophehad. Give it to his daughters. Okay, this is the law, okay? That was verse 2. To give it to his daughters. They're saying, we recognize you just changed the law, but now we got a problem. How do we resolve this? What if they marry somebody, not who we tell them to marry? What if they marry somebody outside the tribe? So maybe Joseph's tribe, maybe they marry somebody in Simeon's tribe. Well, now the land passes over to Simeon's tribe because they become the wife. Remember, at this time, women were property. So they can choose a husband over here now, okay? And so all of a sudden they take with them the inheritance. And so our plot of land gets a little smaller by doing that. Okay, now we don't know their motives. Scholars have argued over it. Are they just, we want our land and we want to keep it there? Or is it that they're really thinking, this law that you gave us has got problems. It's going to work. There's no law that's perfect. So God says, okay, that's true. Okay, so verse 5, at the Lord's command, Moses gave this order to the Israelites. What the tribe of Joseph is saying is right. This is what the Lord commands for the daughters. They can marry anyone they want within their own tribe. Okay, but they can't marry outside the tribe because they'll take the land with them. Because he hasn't solved the problem yet of ownership of women. That has to be solved. And it's very complicated culturally to untangle all of these pieces to get us to where we are. Today, we're not perfect, but we've established dignity at every level here within the church and our culture. But they didn't have that privilege. So they're aware that you just gave it legally to the women, and if they marry outside the tribe, we lose our inheritance. Okay, this is a statement about God's covenant. At the very core of this question is, you made a promise to us that we would get to keep this land. And our tribe gets to keep our plot of land, but you just created a loophole to take the land out of our inheritance. Okay? Now remember, they had never owned land. And God just gave them land. And that's part of the covenant. That's the covenant he made with Abraham, Genesis 15. It's yours. You get to keep it. It's your plot of land. Now enjoy it. Take care of it. Why did he make creation? Number one, so we would have fun and enjoy it. Okay, we live right here. How many of you enjoy that? Look out the mountains over there. How many of you enjoy this incredible view? Those of you that are visitors, you better raise your hands because you just spent money to come up here. Okay, he made this for our enjoyment, but he also made it to us so we have something to take care of. I've argued for years that the heart of every healthy environmental policy is ownership. When's the last time you rented a car and you changed the oil before you took it back? Well, you don't own it, okay? But you do with your own car. And then the third reason is because he wants you to understand there's somebody bigger than you out there. The heavens shout the glory of God. All of creation, he argues, is sending us the same message, God's glory. And that's there to help us see that. So this is a whole question of his inheritance right here. It's a question of his covenant, the promise that he made. And the leaders recognize he had created a loophole and they need to bring it to his attention. So this is why this occurs right at the very end, because I think God's got a big smile on his face with these daughters because they keep pushing the envelope. And he said, right, so let them marry whoever they want. Do you realize what a shift this is in world history? This is a massive shift. In most of the Eastern nations today, it's still arranged marriages. I have lots and lots and lots of students in Nepal, in India, in Cambodia. That means their marriages are arranged. And for him to say, no, they have freedom. That's why Jesus can say, when the Father sets you free, you are free indeed. Okay? So he comes up a revision to the law before they enter the land to solve a problem that's about to be created. And one of the things we learn through this study is that he doesn't always tell us the answer right away. He lets us get to the place where we figure it out. That's why the daughters of Zelophehad in chapter 27, we don't think it's right that we don't get down land because we're women. And he says, you're right. You're right. And so they bring the problem to God and he says, okay, let's solve it. All you have to do is ask. So that raises a theological question. Number one is, do you really believe in the promises of God? Like I said, your view of grace is directly dependent on your view of sin. The weaker your view of sin, it's not that bad, and grace is not that powerful. But if you understand the true nature of depravity, okay, it's a theological term. Every Christian denomination holds to it. That means that there's not one single atom of moral goodness. Not one. That's why he says to Isaiah, your deeds are like filthy rags to me. They're worth nothing. And when you understand that, then you understand the cross is really important. It's really important. And so that's what he does, is he solved this problem so that he goes on in verse 8. Now this is where world history changes. Remember where we are at this point in the history of the world. Every daughter who inherits, he just opened the doors to every woman. First time in world history. Every daughter who inherits land in any Israelite tribe must marry someone in her father's tribal clan. So that way, the covenant will be intact. They get to keep the land. And they get to keep it in the right order. And he solved a problem that hasn't become a problem yet, but in the next book, it's about to be if he doesn't address it. So then he concludes Numbers. These are the commands and regulations the Lord gave through Moses to the Israelites on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from the Jericho. That's on the eastern side of the Jordan. They haven't crossed over yet. So now, they're ready. They've already lived out their faith. They've learned their lesson. Okay. What happens if they hadn't learned their lesson? I said before, a good statement of Numbers is, the Lord has patience and the desert has sand. If this generation had not demonstrated faithfulness, he would have said, back out for 40 years. Another generation. And if they hadn't learned, back out into the desert. But the second generation learned the lessons because the first generation taught them. So what looks to us like a curse, the 40 years of wandering in the desert, is actually a blessing. It gave that first generation the chance to tell their children, don't do what we did. Don't do what we did. Listen to the Lord and trust Him. Next Sunday, we have a different pastor up here. Listen to him. Okay? I've asked you several times over the last few months, because you've all been asking me questions. It's hard to make transition. Is he going to be as good as you? Is he going to love us as good as you? Are we going to become another American church? Blah, 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 blah. You guys are great as sheep. And what's my answer been every time? Are you going to love Ryan and Lauren and the girls like you love Nancy and me? You get to decide that. It's a question I asked you 12 years ago. What kind of church do you want to be? I can't make you into any kind of church. All I can do is bring the scriptures out to you, the stories. You get to decide. Are you going to be loving people or argumentative people? Are you going to work together with Ryan and the elders, or are you going to be rebellious? What are you going to do? I won't be here next Sunday, but you will. So just like he's saying here, be faithful. Okay? If you were there last night, you saw you have a great young pastor. He's so good. He was nervous for the first question or two, and I just laughed. But pretty soon he found his way. He's devoted his life, like all pastors should, to be a shepherd. To love you, to bring God out to you, to instruct you in the ways. And I didn't pull my stool out today. I thought about doing it just one more time. For members, you know what that means, so I could kind of beat you a little bit. No. You guys know the way of faith. You know it. You've walked it for 12 years. Don't stop. Father, thank you Thank you for being such a kind and considerate God. Thank you for disciplining us and teaching us rather than punishing us. Thank you for showing us the way, for leading us, for guiding us. Thank you for these incredible stories, these incredible sagas that show us your grace and your love. And Father, thank you for bringing our church a really good pastor. That's a wonderful, wonderful gift from you. And I pray for your blessing on him and this church. In your Son's name, Jesus, our high priest, we pray. Amen.